Medical Matters with Dr. D. Thursdays, 7 to 8 p.m. on Capital 88.1 FM. Dr. D on Capital 88.1 FM.
Hi, if you've just joined us, it's just gone 7 o'clock on a Thursday, and you know that's the place to be, is Capital Radio, listening to myself, Dr. Deshni Chonan, on Medical Matters. It's a show where we talk about medical topics that you, the listeners, have been asking us for. So, last week we had Dr. Shankar Chetty. It sparked quite a response from all our listeners. So we thought, couldn't think of a better idea for this week was then to have part two, so we could answer the questions that many of you had after thinking about what Dr. Chetty had explained and discussed based on his observations from last week. So for those of you that missed the discussion last week, we were talking about Dr. Chetty's observations and treatments on COVID-19 since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic from last year. So quick background on Dr. Chetty. So Dr. Shankar Chetty is a general practitioner with a natural science background in genetics, advanced biology, microbiology, and biochemistry. And basically, from the start of the COVID pandemic, he has been critically watching and observing from his patient base the way the infection has progressed to be able to give an idea about the pathogenesis behind COVID-19. With his wealth of knowledge, he seems to have a very unique background in being able to understand COVID-19. For anyone that knows, the basis of medicine is basically biology, microbiology, biochemistry, and genetics. It's the foundation that sets up medicine as a whole. So for all of you that would like to ask us questions, you are more than welcome to on our WhatsApp line 065 4211 380. You can also catch us on our Facebook Live page, as well as our Radio Garden app, as well as Mixcloud. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Chetty introduce himself again, and then we can continue the conversation that we've had from last week. Hi, Dr. Chetty. Thank you so much for joining us again this week.
You're welcome, and good evening to your audience.
We had quite an interesting conversation last week. Hey, lots of feedback and lots of interesting questions that came forward from our listeners.
That's what we wanted to do, Doc, stimulate some healthy debate.
Yeah, we wanted to give you the information about what was going on from a practitioner's point of view to be able to understand what they've been seeing in practice. So Dr. Shankar is based in the South Coast. He's actually based all of these information from his observations from over 2,000 patients that he's already treated with COVID. And like he was saying, it wasn't something that had started out with an intention of making public or even, speaking about it on a public forum. He was urged by his client base as well as his staff to make known his observations purely because they were becoming too obvious to ignore. So, Dr. Shankar, do you want to quickly just review what we were talking about last week about how we split COVID-19 into two basic components? The first one being in the first 7 days, and the second part being from day 8 to day 14. And we said there were two parts, one being a viral infection, and then from day 8 to day 14, we were looking at it more of a hypersensitivity. Just as a quick recap to those listeners that are new to today.
Okay. From the start of getting a COVID infection, there is a latent period or an incubation period which is asymptomatic. It becomes difficult to track the illness from that point. Mm-hmm. So we started tracking it from the first day or onset of symptoms. Now, onset of symptoms, we shouldn't disregard the smaller symptoms. So from the day you started feeling unwell is when the clock starts. So even if you have a sore throat for a day or so and felt a little unwell and recovered, that is the start of your COVID illness. Mm-hmm. The infection tends to last 7 days, a week. Patients generally on the 6th and 7th day start to feel a lot better. But on the 8th day, with those that are genetically susceptible, they will trigger a hypersensitivity reaction. And that brings on a whole new set of symptoms and should dictate a whole new set of protocols to treat. For those listeners watching, the way to ensure your safety during coronavirus is to not underestimate any new symptoms. Even if you have a sore throat for a day and you felt unwell and recovered, mm-hmm. you need to mark your calendar a week later and start looking for breathlessness, body pains, or fatigue. And if those occur exactly a week later, you definitely have COVID and you need to seek urgent medical attention.
Okay. So since we're mentioning this right now, there was one of the questions that had come through from a listener from last week. So one of the options, and you'd also mentioned this to me when we chatted about it as well. So what happens if you find that you have all these signs and symptoms? Yes, you've got the sore throat. You're feeling a bit like you're not sure. Maybe your taste is going a little bit. And we've been told to isolate. So do you just isolate for those 14 days, or do you actually go and get tested?
Look, the test is not very sensitive. So early on the illness, we find a lot of patients that eventually turn out to be positive, testing negative. So I think the test can confuse patients into thinking they're negative. The guidelines show that even if you test negative and had a positive contact, you need to isolate for 10 days. In those 10 days, I generally advise my patients to watch for symptoms that start. But the rub is, on the first day, we are preparing you for a war that might occur on the 8th day. So I'd not like to see you on the 6th day with the bronchitis that hasn't been treated.
Yeah.
So I would suggest patients that develop symptoms seek medical attention immediately. And the aim is to overcome those symptoms as quickly as possible so that you're well enough to deal with a reaction on the 8th day, if it occurs.
Okay, great. So since we are talking about testing, I feel like it's a bit of a confusing issue to lots of patients. One of the questions I always get asked from my patients is, look, my 14 days is over. Can you give me a letter so that I can go and get a retest? You and I both know this happens very commonly. So do you want to explain why we usually do not give you like a note or a script to be able to say, listen, you need to go to the lab to get another test after 14 days?
Look, the test itself is looking for a specific viral protein. It's not actually looking for the virus itself. So early tests have shown to be negative and falsely negative. Positive tests tend to have a higher specificity. So we can believe a positive test, but we've got to be very cautious about accepting a negative test. Now, seeing that the virus replicates in your body for 7 days, after the 7 days, if there is no severe clinical illness, you are generally non-infectious to those around you. So we've calculated a leeway period of another 3 days to ensure that you're non-infectious. Some people go back for a repeat test and find it still turns out positive. But that positive test does not mean infectivity. It's just picking up viral protein that still remains in the body as debris. So a positive test after 10 days does not mean you're still infectious to those around.
Okay, great. So just to recap what Dr. Chetty is saying is, you are bound, if you have a test done 14 days later, you are bound to be positive. But it does not mean that you now are going to be able to infect other people. And that's the crux of isolation, is that in your infective period, we're trying to protect the people around you so that you do not spread the infection. But post 14 days, you still are going to test positive, but you are no longer harboring live virus. So that will not be able to be spread, because the PCR test is just basically testing for the protein. It's a part, you're looking for a part. So it doesn't matter whether it's live or dead, it's going to pick it up. So it gives people a lot. It's very, I think it riddles people with anxiety, because now you're like, oh my God, I've gone through this and I'm still positive. I still have COVID-19. What am I going to do? And that's not the case. And that's why, to try to err on the side of caution and not, spread that type of anxiety, we usually do not do that test post the 14 days, because you're considered non-infectious, so you're safe to be around. So we wanted to know about, another patient wanted to find out, because we've been so specific about the days, and you also said that it's very important that you keep count of what days you are at, because things change based on the phase of the infection. So we had a question last week from Junaid Hassan, who wanted to know, if I am on day 7, what must I now do? What is the next steps that I'm supposed to follow?
Look, until we're able to figure out who's susceptible to having the reaction, on day 7, you need to start being vigilant about certain symptoms, because I find that the symptoms are a good predictor of the start of the reaction. And that is the only predictor we have at the moment. So it's not only the breathlessness can take a few days to develop, but I found that commonly body aches and pains and a sudden onset of fatigue are indicators of the start of this reaction. And the reaction is such that if you wait for breathlessness to set in, which might take a few days to surface, you've already passed the point where we can be quick to stop this reaction. So patients just need to be very vigilant on that 8th day of those 3 particular symptoms. I found that I think with almost 99% predictivity that this occurs on the 8th day. I've had the odd patient present on the 7th day or the 9th day, and that I put down, those were patients that weren't absolutely sure about when their illness started. But all those that were absolutely sure about when it started, we could predict it almost to whether it was the afternoon of that 8th day on the first day or the evening. So I had a lot of patients contact me on the 8th day and say, oh, I'm perfectly fine, and nothing's happened. And by the late that evening, they suddenly phone back and say, I'm fatigued. And if we trace it back, exactly a week earlier, they develop symptoms in the evening. So it's almost exactly a week later that you start to experience these symptoms. I do advise patients as well that the onset of such symptoms in mild cases can go undiagnosed. So the patients that have severe reactions are easy to catch clinically. But those that have very mild symptoms tend to ignore them. And those are the patients that would present quite late and with reactions that are prolonged. So it's vitally important not to underestimate those symptoms on the 8th day. I generally advise patients that if you're feeling well on the 7th day and get up on the 8th day with slight body aches and pains, that's significant enough to report.
Okay. So since you mentioning mild, moderate, and severe, and a lot of people might not know which part of their symptoms equivocates to each of those. So do you want to break it down? What would you consider mild versus what would you consider moderate to severe?
Meaning on the 8th day.
In terms of the symptoms a patient might have, yes.
With the reaction.
Yes.
Look, that is something that's very difficult to predict. It takes a few days of non-treatment for us to understand how fast the disease actually is spreading or is evolving. So you get some patients evolve to a ventilator within a day or two, and you get others who remain mildly fatigued for a month or two. So those would be the slow progressors. Now, it's pragmatic to treat everyone as severe until proved otherwise.
Okay.
Missing the reaction or under-treating it will result in consequences further down the line.
Okay. So Dr. Chetty is basically saying it's very important to keep track of the days and the number of days you are into your infection, purely because based on his observations, around the 8 days when you're going to get the start of the hypersensitivity reaction. And that's usually something that moves very quickly and is usually where we find a lot of difficulty in treating patients, especially when you present too late. So if you find you are now counting down and you feel as you're approaching the 8th day, you're finding you're not feeling so well, you're finding the breathlessness is coming on, chest tightness, then it is safe to please go and report this to your doctor to be able to get help at that point, because it's always better to treat this earlier rather than later, because we were discussing that when you present later, you've got this whole inflammatory process that's going on in your body, and it leaves lots of scar tissue and scarring, and it leaves you with lots of consequences later on. That is why your recovery rate later seems to be more prolonged, because a lot of the very common questions that was asked last week was, why do I feel like I'm now day 21 and I still feel so exhausted and tired and breathless? Why do I feel that? Dr. Chetty, do you want to quickly just recap on that for the listeners that actually weren't here last week to listen?
Okay. What transpires from the 8th day onwards is a basic allergic reaction, an immune response. This results in the release of chemical mediators. Now, dependent on how allergic you are, this response can be very severe, or it can be very mild and prolonged, or it can be very mild and transient, similar to an allergic reaction to peanuts or a bee sting. What transpires is you get an initial release of mediators. Those mediators, if not mopped up urgently, will communicate this reaction to a group of other mediators. And every day that passes, there are more mediators sequestered into this reaction. So the earlier you stop it, the fewer mediators you have to deal with. And in doing so, lessen the damage that might be caused down the line. Now, those patients that seem to have prolonged reactions, those that have severe reactions go untreated and end up on ventilators and have very high mortality. Whereas of those that have what we call prolonged reactions, they are having a very mild reaction, but because it's untreated and the body has to try and fight it itself, these reactions remain prolonged.
Mm-hmm.
And people feel those symptoms, either body pain or fatigue or breathlessness for a prolonged period. But these symptoms are not sufficient to challenge your life. So it can take a very long time for your body to overcome them and return to a semblance of normality.
Okay, okay. So I hope that has answered a lot of your questions for those of you that have asked about it. There's another question that you and I were both asked. If you are saying that the infection is not going to go anywhere, we're not going to stop it, was the lockdown necessary? Like, why did we embark on something if we cannot cure this by staying at home? So why did we have to go through a lockdown?
Okay. Look, Desh, it's very important that we understand what we're trying to achieve with all the measures that we put in place. We've used lockdowns. If you look at what we should be doing pragmatically, we got lockdowns, we have treatment protocols, we have prophylactic protocols. So each thing is there to an end. We must understand what we're trying to achieve with each of these things. Now, when this virus took hold, it spread very quickly. And the reason that it made headlines was because of its morbidity or mortality. If it was a rash that was a pandemic and nobody died, we wouldn't have it in the media today. So the reason this has made global headlines is because of the morbidity and mortality that it causes. And all signs should be directed at curbing that mortality and morbidity. Now, when the virus hit, we didn't understand it. And it spread very quickly, 10 times faster than the common flu would. So we needed to slow its spread for a few reasons. Paramount was that our hospital systems wouldn't cope with the influx of patients coming in that were critically ill.
Yeah.
So we needed to slow its spread. As well, we needed to gain an understanding of how this causes the disease so that we could find ways to address it, as well to curb the mortality and morbidity. That's the reason we locked down. It's basically to limit the spread of the virus. But the lockdown measures are there to achieve a specific goal. They are not meant to be indefinite. So I would have expected that once we instituted lockdown, all our resources would have been put into upgrading our health facilities to cope with an influx once the lockdown was eased, and a better understanding of the disease and its evolution so that we could have developed treatment protocols to curb the mortality and morbidity. If we know how to treat the illness and nobody is going to be injured or die from this, then we can ease the lockdown and have everyone get treated for it as and when it shows up. So the whole aim of the lockdown was to slow its spread down.
Okay, so I hope that explains to a lot of you that wanted to know why we had the lockdown, what was the purpose. It was purely to allow health services to be able to handle the influx that was coming in, because I know when the second wave had happened a lot sooner than a lot of us had expected, and the influx towards the middle of November towards December was incredible. And a lot of healthcare practitioners and healthcare facilities were taking on immense strain. So for those of you that are just tuned in, it's gone 1919, and we're talking to Dr. Shankar Chetty, who is a general practitioner with a natural science background who has treated over 2,000 COVID-positive patients and has found consistent results in the way he has treated patients, and he has found consistency in his version of the pathogenesis, and what he has found is the evolution of COVID-19, and he's sharing his findings with us. So to any of you that might have any questions about what we're talking about, please feel free to contact us on 065 4211 Alternatively, we are live on our Facebook page, as well as our Radio Garden app, as well as our Mixcloud. So we're trying to get you on all platforms. So we're going to take a small music break. Dr. Chetty has actually provided us with our music selection for today, so I hope you enjoy it. The first song we're going to listen to is When Will I See You Again by 3 Degrees.
Precious I'm just telling you to have an open mind. Just imagine us. You're taking me there, you're taking me there. Our lips are barely touching. So do it again, so do it again. We could be on to something. Hey, oh, hey, oh. I just wanna feel your body on me. Hey, oh, hey, oh. If you want it, then you got it for me. No more wasting time. We can go all night. Hey, oh, hey, oh. I just wanna feel your body on me. Body on me. Body on me.
Put you up against the wall, and I'ma go to work till you get off. Baby, soon as we're done, we'll go some more. Girl, just imagine us. You're taking me there, you're taking me there. Our lips are barely touching. So do it again, so do it again.
We could be on to something. Hey, oh, hey, oh. I just wanna feel your body on me. Hey, oh, hey, oh. If you want it, then you got it, homie. No more wasting time. We can go all night. Hey, oh, hey, oh. I just wanna feel your body on me. Body on me. Body on me. Body on me.
I'm not asking for too much. Put your fingertips on me.
Don't wait till the sun's up. We can keep this thing between
Us, only nobody.
has to know what's going down right now, baby. Hey, oh, hey, oh. I just wanna feel your body on me. Hey, oh, hey, oh. If you want it, then you got it, homie. No more wasting time. We can go all night. Hey, oh, hey, oh. I just wanna feel your body on me.
Medical Matters with Dr. D. Thursdays, 7 to 8 p.m. on Capital 88.1 FM. Dr. D on Capital 88.1 FM.
Hi, if you've just joined me, it's gone 1926. You're listening to myself, Dr. Deshni Chanan, on Medical Matters on Capital Radio. This is where you find me every Thursday between 7 to 8 p.m. talking about the medical topics that you have been asking us for. And today is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Shankar Chetty discussing COVID-19 and his observations in his outpatient setting. After having treated over 2,000 COVID-positive patients, Dr. Chetty's noticed some very consistent results, and he's here to share his experiences with us today. So we've had lots of responses from last week's conversation, and we're trying to answer as many of those questions that we had brought forward from last week. So one of the major ones that has come up is ivermectin. So what is your opinion about ivermectin, Dr. Chetty?
Okay. Ivermectin is an antiprotozoal agent. Recent studies have shown that it has great benefit in killing the virus. It's virucidal and tends to do so within 48 hours of taking. Now, this drug has been looked at from the start of COVID. It was also the reason hydroxychloroquine found fame in the first wave, that it has the ability to kill the virus. Both ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine also possess immunomodulatory properties. which are well documented with skin infections and rashes and that kind of thing. For those who are looking at the veterinary science, it's also used to treat mange in dogs. So even the vets know that it's immunomodulated. So with ivermectin, countries have been using it now for quite a while: Australia, India, Iran, and the studies that have come out have shown great benefit. It seems to be of benefit in the first viral phase of this illness, and it's shown some benefit in the hypersensitivity phase, and I think that's more to its immunomodulatory capacity. Unfortunately, it's taken a long while for this drug to get approval by certain regulators, and that's caused a lot of controversy and a lot of contempt from different sectors. Look, it has been shown to be beneficial. I think that the delay in having it authorized for general public use has caused a lot of controversy, and it's caused a lot of sale on the black market, people using veterinary alternatives, that kind of thing. But I think that this has to be laid at the feet of the governing bodies, because we need to be able to give clinicians a free hand at using what they think works. Ivermectin is a very safe drug. We've got many years of experience with it, so the safety data does not need to be recollected. All we need to do is establish efficacy. And I think the place to start with doing that is to look at clinicians treating patients, not necessarily doing clinical trials to find data on its efficacy. In a pandemic, like I said in the last, it is unethical for us to be trying to conduct clinical trials. If anything shows a semblance of having a benefit, we should be using it. We don't have any alternatives. So I think that the outcry from public is justified in pushing the regulatory authorities to start to look at things a little more closely. It's being used in Australia, it's being used in India, and they haven't had any criticism from the global bodies like the World Health Organization. And they went ahead and distributed it. So I think South Africa needs to understand that the clinicians that are treating COVID need to have a lot of voice in this, and a bigger say in what we do to the patients in front of us, not researchers or medical scientists that are not involved in actual treatment of patients.
Okay. So another question, is ivermectin the only drug to be able to treat in that
No, it
antiviral,
isn't.
in the virucidal phase?
Yes, this is a problem as well. When you try and limit the access or information to a particular drug, then you get all these theories coming out, and it's touted as a miracle cure. It actually isn't. It does have its benefits, but it is part of a toolbox of drugs that need to be used to treat this. I'm in contact with colleagues in India who actually use this drug quite openly for prophylaxis, for treatment. And even though patients are treated with ivermectin, they do get into the hypersensitivity phase and require doctors with an understanding of what's happening to adjust treatment accordingly to curtail any adverse events that might follow. So it has shown great benefit. It is in the first phase of this illness, the viral phase, about the best medication we've seen so far. Now, a lot of the controversy that circulates with ivermectin, I think, stems solely from governing bodies and the messages that they put out surrounding the drug. There have been messages put out about no treatment for coronavirus. There have been messages put out about isolation being the only way, and only to seek treatment when you require hospitalization, not before. All these protocols have actually caused a lot of confusion amongst people. And I think the general public are not ignorant and shouldn't be treated as such. So I think the full range of information needs to be put out there. Ivermectin has been used around the world in many different countries, and there have been great reviews for it. but I don't see why it needs a journal publication before we can make it a little more mainstream. And by allowing doctors to prescribe it, you would avoid all the illicit trade in it. People are desperate,
Yeah.
so they will try whatever they can with it. But in the history of ivermectin, I don't think that anyone has died from a prescription of it. Let's not count the guy who took the dose for a cow. That's not going to factor in our clinical trials. So I think we can push this ahead a little quicker. Coronavirus is not going to be here forever. And the quicker we get to treating it, more lives we'll save. So I think we need to relook at how we do this for the future.
So another question that has come forward is, now that SAPRA has decided to permit the access to ivermectin, but under compassionate and controlled access. So what exactly does that mean?
That means you're going to have to apply for the use of the medication. So when they say controlled and compassionate use, that limits when you can use it. So you've got to have a patient that's critically ill where nothing else has worked, and then they'll say, fine, you can try ivermectin. But that defeats the purpose. So I think we need to trust clinicians a little bit more in making the decisions for the patients that are in front of them, rather than leaving it to people that are not seeing patients to have a say in how we dispense such medication.
Okay. So coming on to another topic that has lots of people debating, the vaccine. Do we take the vaccine? Is it going to help? What is the point?
Okay. There's been a lot of controversy around the vaccine, and I think the controversy is very well founded. Look, I think a healthy dose of logic, pragmatism, and education and information is very important in convincing a population of what your intentions are. And because of the nature of the information being passed on, I think the public have developed a healthy skepticism about the intention of those that are trying to push the vaccine. If I had to look at, and look, I don't want to be labeled as anti-vaccine. I think it has its place, and that place needs to be understood and clearly articulated to the public. Now, if I had to look at how this pandemic has played out, from the start of the pandemic, there's been messages put out that we should not go to our doctors, we should isolate ourselves, we shouldn't spread this illness, we need to only go to hospitals if we find that we cannot cope on our own. So it's isolated doctors from their patients. And so doctors have to follow these protocols. And in doing so, it has limited the understanding of how this disease evolves. Now, on the flip side of that, a lot of the research was put into the development of the vaccine. And I understand the financial motives for research to be directed in that direction. The research should have been put into the evolution and the pathogenesis of this illness so that we could understand treatments for it, because the patient in front of me needs my assistance, and it's treatment that's going to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Now, if you looked at pragmatically as to what we actually doing, from the start, every medication that has shown any benefit has been stopped. The councils and the governance that be have insisted on proper clinical trials to show efficacy. And so that has prevented and scared doctors into prescribing a lot of medication that we've used for many years, and we've never had any safety issues with it. But unfortunately, the medical professionals have to follow the protocols that are passed down by the powers that be. So in doing so, it has forced a lot of doctors not to actually treat patients and to pass on that message that there's no treatment for this. I find it strange that we need clinical trials on medication that benefits the patient right in front of me, but I don't see any clinical trials done to show that there's no treatment for this disease. Yet we allowed that opinion to be amplified globally. Now, it seems strange that we could not rush through emergency authorization for drugs that clinicians around the world are screaming about that has been shown to save lives.
Mm.
And we intend to use these medications on critically ill patients to save lives, to reduce the mortality and morbidity, which was our initial intention. But it seems strange that the powers that be would give an emergency authorization to a set of experimental vaccines. Let's be clear, these are experimental vaccines. They are all in phase 3 trials. I think the only vaccine that has gotten through phase 3 trials is one from India called Covishield. The rest have not gotten through phase 3 trials. And phase 3 trials were meant to look at adverse events, side effects, all that kind of thing, so that we could design a patient information leaflet for the vaccine. Now, suddenly you get the world bodies pass an emergency authorization for experimental vaccines to be used on a global scale to get phase 3 clinical trial information on a population that's healthy. That doesn't make sense. And I think that the layman understands that and will have a healthy skepticism about why this vaccine is necessary.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be looked at more closely and from a scientific perspective.
Okay, so I'm going
Yes.
I wanted to just backtrack a little, just so I wanted to give people a quick an idea of why we vaccinate in general. What is the purpose of it?
The purpose of vaccination is to prevent people getting the illness, so that if you develop corona or you come into contact with coronavirus, you have the antibodies necessary to shorten the span of that illness and you could have no major consequence to it. Now, there's a lot of controversy that was sparked by the messages coming out from those that make the vaccine. If I remember correctly, it was touted around the world that we'll never get back to any semblance of normalcy if we don't get this vaccine out. And then, so Bill Gates and the powers that be said that, look, if we want to get back to normal, everyone needs to be vaccinated, or at least 60 to 70% of the population, so that we can develop herd immunity. Now the message being put out is that if you take the vaccine, it will prevent you getting severe illness. They haven't proven that it will stop you getting the infection, and it hasn't proven that it will stop you spreading it. So now we're going to take a vaccine. We're still going to wear the masks and keep away from our family and socially distance. So we got to wonder why. What's the point? Why do we all need to be vaccinated, especially if we don't have proper safety and long-term safety data on vaccines that tend to have long-term effects? Yet medication that tend to have side effects that are reversible have been sidelined. So I think the controversy or the concern of the general public is well-founded. And the people that are in charge of manufacturing these vaccines need to be able to stand up and answer these questions.
Yeah. So for those of you that just joined us, it's gone 1941. We're having an interesting discussion with Dr. Shankar Chetty, who is sharing his observations based on treating his over 2,000 positive COVID patients with exceptional results. So he has taken the time to explain to us the disease, the process, and the things that would be necessary to help strengthen our immune system and to fight through the infection. We've got a little bit more questions on ivermectin. I'm going to ask you one quickly. Like we said, we knew this was going to spark a whole lot of questions. So I have a question from Ishta Soni that wanted to know, in terms of taking ivermectin, do we take it before or after being diagnosed?
Look, ivermectin has been found to be of benefit both prophylactically and during the illness. From the protocol set up in India, I think it's most widely used in that country. So we can look at their protocols for some clarity. It's been used in healthcare professionals there as prophylactic medication, but we've got to be very cautious about using this drug prophylactically. If it's used on a wide scale with patients that are really not exposed to coronavirus, we're going to develop some sort of resistance, and we lose its benefit in saving lives and treating acute illness. So I think prophylactic use should be very limited to people that are at very high risk of developing coronavirus or in constant contact with positive patients. As far as treatment goes, it has been used throughout the evolution of the coronavirus illness from the viral phase through to the hypersensitivity phase. And it's been shown to have benefits in decreasing the length of the illness, decreasing the mortality of the illness quite significantly by 40 odd percent, decreasing the length of hospitalizations, decreasing the need for ventilation. So these are results that again cannot be ignored.
Yeah.
And if we look at the trials done around the world, if you look at the statistical significance of those trials, even though they were not meant to be clinical trials, all the statistical significance falls to the right side of the graph, which shows that even the clinical trials that were conducted have consistent results with those that were not meant to be clinical trials. So it does show the benefit. The problem with it is that we need to start getting protocols in place for its common use here in South Africa and start to train doctors on how it should be used and when it should.
Okay. So before
And
we-
unfortunately,
yes.
that's going to be left to the powers that be.
Yeah, no, it's it's taken some time to get to the point where we're at actually. So before we move any further, speaking about the drug protocols that we actually wanted to talk about today, I have another question from a Stuart Van Zyl, who's actually said, thank you very much, it's been an excellent program. So he says he doesn't know if he had COVID or not, as he didn't experience any symptoms, or maybe he did. But the question is now he only has a sore throat. So he just wants to know, what is the difference between a normal flu and COVID symptoms?
Look, frankly, there is absolutely no difference. So because of that, you shouldn't take any symptom lightly. As a doctor, I'm able to put together a group of symptoms that make coronavirus illness more likely. Now, the common things that we see are sore throats, persistent cough. Some people develop body aches and pains, fatigue. And generally in the viral phase, it tends to be flu-like body aches and pains, generally. We've also seen with this new variant, a very large percentage of people developing gastrointestinal symptoms, from nausea to abdominal cramps to diarrhea. Now, if I see a patient, and of course the loss of smell and taste, that's the big symptom. But remember that loss of smell and taste has been shown to occur in about 30% of patients. So an absence of that loss doesn't rule out coronavirus. We've also found that those patients that develop that loss of smell and taste tend not to develop very severe illness for some reason. And that was from a study done in India.
Okay.
So I would suspect that if you developed coronavirus, that would be a good symptom to have, a predictor of less severe illness. But I guess you got to look at the entire picture from an educated perspective to rule out or assume coronavirus infection. So I would advise the general public not to take any symptoms lightly.
Yeah.
I've advised and trained my patients well before the pandemic arrived to come and see me when they develop these symptoms. Now, a lot of the problems that I notice now with this new wave is that a lot of patients are presenting pretty late. And strangely, I've noticed that those patients that present late are those that seem to be more educated. And that's strange. I found that with my rural population, which I have a large contingent of, the word spread very quickly that we must seek treatment very early. So generally, when I ask those patients about the onset of symptoms, it's generally a day or two. Most patients present on the day it starts. But generally, more educated patients tend to present a lot later in the disease. So I think the self-medication, the looking to pharmacies to try and solve the problems, all it's doing is wasting time and giving me less time to prepare you for that war that might occur on the 8th day. So I've been trying to educate patients about the importance of presenting very early in the illness. Don't take any symptoms for granted. You get a sore throat, You feel unwell, you get to the doctor immediately. A lot of people ask, I suffer with sinusitis, so when I have a runny nose, is that the reason to run off to the doctor and get a test done and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
But if we consider no two of us are the same, so let's talk about your normal. So you know what's normal for you, and you know when you feel unwell.
Yeah.
And that feeling of being unwell is vitally important to recognize and get to your doctor. So when you question patients, patients will say, developed a sore throat on Wednesday. So it's important to interrogate that. And so the next question is usually, were you perfectly fine on Tuesday? And the answer usually is, no, on Tuesday I had a bit of body aches and pains. Then were you perfectly fine on Monday? And on Monday I was fine. So Tuesday becomes the day you started your symptoms. So it's vitally important to plot that day that the symptoms started, because it's going to predict when the hypersensitivity is going to start, and that is the thing that is going to take lives and cause the morbidity. I'm sure we've all heard of many cases where people narrate stories that the patient was actually getting better and improving.
Yes.
And he suddenly took a turn for the worse and got rushed to hospital. And now this is it. On the 6th and 7th day, there is an improvement in symptoms. And I'm of the opinion that it is the cessation of the viral part of this illness. And the start of the new reaction on day 8 is what causes a sudden worsening of symptoms.
Yeah.
And that's the reason we're hearing of those stories. So it's very easy for people to underestimate this.
Okay, but since we're talking about this and not everybody has the same type of reaction, how do we know who's most sensitive? How, is there something that we can predict? Do we have an idea?
Look, I would have expected that by now testing would have evolved in that direction. If we could develop tests to predict who would be more allergic to this, then we could identify the 30-odd% of the population that are allergic to this virus. And if we know who that 30% are, then it would guide our isolation measures and treatment measures. They would be the ones that would have to wear the masks and stay at home and consider a vaccine if you need it. But the 70% that are not allergic, it would be a common flu for them.
Yeah.
And we could then allow the 70% of the population that are not really at risk to be the ones to go out and get this infection and develop the herd immunity. And we'd actually get past this a lot quicker if we had that those kinds of tests in place. There is a genetic predisposition. So what we have right now is we've seen a lot of father and son deaths.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of mother and daughter deaths with the opposite sex spared. So that is the only predictor that we have for now. So if I see a father that has coronavirus, I make it my duty to warn his son about his risk.
Okay.
So that's about the only way to predict this.
Yeah, because it's been something that lots of people have asked, because we've said, look, it's hypersensitive and some people react in a different way, and how would you know? So I think it is a fitting question to be able to know, how can I protect myself in that regard? I do actually have a question here on WhatsApp. So the question is, the vaccine was initially clinically approved for the initial strain. So what about the new variant that we have? Will it still work? And if so, for how long?
Look, there's a lot of controversy brewing about the immunity that a vaccine would provide you. And I think, again, the powers that should be explaining this to the general public. I find a duality or a different set of standards that apply to the vaccine and apply to people that have overcome coronavirus infection. With the vaccines, the measure of its ability to stimulate your immunity was its ability our ability to detect antibodies after the vaccine was administered. Now, those antibodies have been touted as the marker for immunity. But we also know that people that have overcome COVID illness have these antibodies. But the antibodies seem to be sufficient to prove that you have immunity with the vaccination, but not enough to prove you've developed immunity after an illness. So I don't understand why it's different in both situations. And then if you look at our immune responses, an antibody response is no indicator of long-term immunity. The proper indicator of long-term immunity is a good T cell response, a memory cell response. At present, we don't have any tests in place to look at T cell responses. So we will never know whether the vaccine actually confers us with long-term immunity. Neither will we know whether infection confers us with long-term immunity. So all these things about vaccines and travel passports and the rest, I think are very premature. Until we can figure such things out, vaccines should be tested a little further. The immune part of this is very poorly understood. I did when the topic of vaccines came up on our chat group with friends in India, where most of the vaccines are being made. I asked a simple question. I said, look, we're dealing with a virus that causes an infection like other viruses do, and we want to develop a vaccine for it. But we also are dealing with a hypersensitivity reaction. And 6 months ago, when I had found what I had found about hypersensitivity, the concern was that if we are allergic to the virus, we'd probably show some hypersensitivity towards the vaccine. And unfortunately, now that the vaccines are being rolled out, we are seeing that. We've had a lot of instances of anaphylactic reactions, general body rashes, those kind of things. And generally more than you would see with other vaccines. So I put this to the colleagues that I have. Are we vaccinating for immunity, or are we vaccinating for tolerance against an allergen? Because if you're allergic to peanuts and I keep exposing you to it, after a while you'll build tolerance to it. So we got to understand how this vaccine works and what it's meant to do. It can be a very dangerous game to try and vaccinate a large population without that knowledge. With the SARS-1 virus, there were vaccine studies that were done when vaccines were made, and they found that it can have disastrous effects, because if we have allergic reactions to the virus, giving someone a vaccine could cause what we call antibody-mediated enhancement. And that is a phenomenon quite commonly encountered. It can affect almost 30% of sensitive individuals. And what they found in animal studies was that when you gave these animals a vaccine and then exposed them to the virus, about 30% of them had a severe allergic response to the virus, which was set up by the vaccination. So until people that are vaccinated get infected, we'll never know the truth. So I think more studies need to be done on these vaccines, and it shouldn't be at the forefront of our attempts to solve this pandemic.
Okay. Very interesting, insight on the vaccine. But I'm going to stay with it because we have one more question about vaccines.
Sure.
So if you've been infected with COVID-19 already, remember you should ideally, to a certain amount of time, have antibodies. Do you still need to take the vaccine?
Look, the antibodies have been shown to circulate for a variable length of time. And antibodies are not an indicator of long-term immunity. Now, tests were done on doctors overseas that got coronavirus, and they could daily monitor their antibody levels. And they found that some doctors lost their antibodies within 16 days of recovering from the illness.
Oh, wow.
Some managed to maintain antibodies for up to 6 months, and then it started to fade. But what we need to realize is that your body doesn't produce antibodies when there is no offending agent. So once you pass the point of infection, the antibodies are no more necessary. They've done their job. But they do have T-cell mediated memory. Now those T-cells that remember the virus are very difficult to find. We have thousands of different subsets of T-cells that look for specific allergens or antibodies to mediate. Now we can develop these T-cell memory cells without it going detected. So recently, I think a study has come out of the University of Cape Town, where they found that such T-cell mediated immunity does exist. And it would give you immunity for anything ranging from a year to lifelong.
Wow.
So I think that, look, if it was up to me, I would have invested all our resources in treating this illness and saving the lives.
Yeah.
And for those that we've saved, the boon would be a free vaccine made by your body that would last the rest of your life and would not cause you any harm. So I think we need a good pragmatic look at what we're trying to do.
No, I do agree with that. I think some of the focus has been shifted along the way. We are almost running to the end of our show, but I'm going to go to one last question, and this is in regard to your article in Modern Medicine. In terms of your treatment protocols, you've split them into, like we said, the viral phase and your hypersensitivity phase, and you use specific medication in each of those phases. I wanted you to explain a little bit more as to what each of them do and why we use them in that particular time.
Okay. During the viral phase of the illness, it is a virus that's infecting your body and causing illness. It is self-limiting. So in that viral phase, our aim is to alleviate symptoms and, of course, alleviate some of the damage the virus might cause. Part of that would be to suppress the virus. Viruses that tend not to be very fast growing do not need suppression, and they limit themselves and leave, so symptomatic treatment does suffice. We know from HIV that we need antiretrovirals and antiviral medications with some illnesses for those that are more severe and might have a more severe viral cause. But we find with coronavirus that the initial 7-day illness is not that severe, and so antivirals and things will be reserved for those with severe illness. But symptomatic treatment tends to suffice. We've also found that medications like doxycycline can slow the replication of the virus and limit viral load. And that is where drugs like ivermectin will have a place in limiting the amount of virus that you have in your body. But what I found was that the viral phase is generally symptomatic treatment and we tend to get over it. The hypersensitivity phase is a different ballgame altogether. And it seems to not be dependent on what transpires in the first 7 days. So patients with very mild symptoms that are very transient can develop very severe hypersensitivity reactions. I've had family members, physicians in America, by the way, who mom and dad and son got infected. Mom had the typical viral illness and got very sick. The son and father had a sore throat for a day, got over it, played tennis during the week. A week later, mom was better, but on the 8th day, father and son both developed fatigue and breathlessness. Unfortunately, dad, after 3 weeks of ventilation, passed away. The son went through almost 2 months of ventilation, and now he has brain damage. He survived it, but will never be the same again. And that's what drew my attention to this blank period in between that actually doesn't have any bearing on the severity. Mom was not allergic, and after 7 days, recovered completely. So it's vitally important to make that distinction that we're dealing with two separate things here. Now, when we deal with the hypersensitivity reaction, we need to stop this cascade of mediators as soon as it starts. So the drugs used in the hypersensitivity phase are there to stop the reaction and the mediators. So that would be antihistamines, because histamine being a very important mediator, anti-leukotrienes like montelukast. We did find with montelukast, it is a medication that takes a little while to work. So those patients started on the 8th day do not tend to do as well as those that were started on the first day. It gave it a chance to build up in your system and suppress that reaction. In India, it's also shown benefit to be used prophylactically.
Okay.
So treating the hypersensitivity phase requires immunosuppression, or if we can get the research in that direction, immunomodulation, so that we can suppress that reaction and not have the consequences.
What's really interesting is that because you've split it into those two different phases, and you've mentioned the drugs that you've mentioned now that you can treat each phase once you've isolated and recognized that that is the phase you are in, these drugs are all available. These are all tried, they are tested, they are things that we have readily available on our hands and tips right now to be able to use, to be able to treat coronavirus. There is something that you did mention, and a lot of people have asked me about it as well. You mentioned the use of prednisone, and you use this usually in the hypersensitivity phase. But in a lot of patients, you do realize with prednisone and diabetic patients, it tends to counteracts because it causes spikes in your blood sugar levels. So how do you go about using it?
Look, with prednisone, and this is going to spark a lot of controversy
Yeah.
in this wave of the pandemic. We managed to get away with relatively conventional doses in the first wave, 50 milligrams a day being standard practice. With this wave, we find that we need far higher doses, and causes a few doctors to raise their eyebrows when they realize what's required. But if you look at the doses that are required for the treatment of pulmonary hypersensitivity pneumonitis, they can go up as high as 500 milligrams a day because your entire aim is to prevent ventilation or intubation.
Yeah.
So there's no point trying to put a fire off with insufficient means. It will start up again and cause problems. Now, with diabetic patients, we do have these complications of affectation to their blood sugar levels. Unfortunately, the only way for now to control those would be to hospitalize them and have their sugars monitored and adjusted accordingly with insulin. We actually caught between a rock and a hard place because if we don't get to the steroids, we're going to have deterioration and mortality. I would hope that research would go in the direction of immunomodulators rather than immunosuppressants. And immunomodulators are not global suppressants of your immunity and wouldn't have that kind of affectation to your sugar values. They would be more specific in how they suppress this reaction and would negate the need for such high doses of steroids. So I think a lot of research needs to go into those particular avenues to try and suppress this. I think as well, we need to look into removing the offending allergen from our bodies.
Yeah.
Simply because this idea of prolonged illness, I found in my patients there are some subset of them when you try and take away the prednisone, the reaction reemerges, and I think that's simply because the allergen is still present. So we've got to look at means of getting rid of this allergen.
It's such a strange thing that you mentioned because I actually had a question that was asked to me just now about steaming and whether this will actually help kill the virus if you do steaming.
Okay, look, Doc, I think we need to understand where all this fits in.
Yeah.
Just in layman's terms, if you came to me with a reaction to peanuts and I put you on treatment, and after 2 or 3 days you were perfectly fine, I weaned you off the steroids and you got better. But now we're finding patients where when we try and wean them off the steroids, the reaction wants to restart again. And I think that's because you still got the peanut in your mouth. So we need to find ways to get the peanut out of you. Now this virus lives in your nose, it lives in your respiratory system, and it lives in your gut. So I think with those patients that are refractory to weaning of steroids, we've got to be considerate of that. And I think that's where steaming comes in. It denatures proteins and would make the protein in your lung from the virus less allergenic. We've noticed that sinus washes and things like that seem to have a benefit. I think it's because we're removing the allergen from your nose. Laxatives might have a benefit, but I think we leave that to the medical community to repurpose them because they're not meant for flus and colds, but I think they'll have some benefits as well. So I think all these little things need to be looked into with a brighter light so that we can make this less scary for the general public. I think there's too much of hopelessness and helplessness on sale at the moment.
I agree. I think that was the reason we wanted to do the show and we wanted to break it up so that you'd have sufficient time to be able to talk about your findings. Because the one thing it gives you is hope, is because if you explain it in the way you've explained the pathogenesis and breaking it down into 2 different parts, where you have your viral part and your hypersensitivity, both parts are treatable if you understand where you are in the pathogenesis of the disease. And that's the whole point of the show that we've been having, is the education of the public about the condition and to give you hope to understand that pay attention to your body because you are the only one that understands exactly what your baseline is, what is normal for you. And to know that when it feels like I'm not feeling right, because I promise you the one thing I've learned from patients is that even clinically, if I feel like I'm not finding what I should be because I'm not taught to, but if my patient is saying to me, I do not feel right, I put a lot of stock in that because patients know their bodies and do not underestimate what your knowledge is. So pay attention to your signs and symptoms. Mark the days that it starts because as Dr. Chetty was saying, the approach of day 8 is where things change very drastically, very quickly. And that is going to be your indication of how severe your reaction is going to be. And if you find that you're not feeling very well around the 7th day, 8 days, seek medical help. Go to your practitioner, explain what you're feeling, get the necessary medication that you're going to get. So the whole aim of the conversation that we've been having, Dr. Chetty, is information. We want you to have the relevant information so you can make the right decisions. But Dr. Chetty, as always, we've actually even extended over the time because we had too many questions to get through. Thank you so much for taking the time because I know how busy you are. I've enjoyed the conversations with you. I've learned so much. Thank you very, very much for being here tonight.
Thank you, and thanks for giving me the platform to share the information and stimulate the robust discussion.
I feel like you've stimulated a lot of discussion. To my incredible listeners, you guys are family. Thank you so much. I hope that the conversations that we've been having has actually helped you, sparked some conversations within your own circles to be able to spread the information. Always join us on a Thursday between 7 to 8 p.m. This is the conversations we have. Any topic that you think is relevant to you is relevant to us. So always drop us an email or WhatsApp line 0654211380, and we will get the people that you want to hear about in studio. Wherever you are, be safe, and we will chat to you next week. I'm going to leave you with one more song from Dr. Chetty. It is George Benson, Never Give Up on a Good Thing. Bye.